So far we have been talking mostly about software vulnerabilities and malware and so on. And now we are going to move to the second part of the course where we are going to cover the foundations. Okay, and we are going to start by talking about cryptography. Okay, so cryptography sort of addresses the more basic question of how do you achieve security, right? So the way you achieve security, whether you think about the real world or the cyber world, it's based on some kind of separation. So you want to separate the entities that are adversarial, meaning they don't trust each other, right? And you want to make sure that you have some kind of way to keep them apart. And how do you do that? Well, the most obvious way and the way we that's most familiar to us is physical separation, right? So you keep thieves out of your home by putting a lock and making sure that they can never enter your house. You can also rely on temporal separation, which means that when one of the adversaries is using the entity, the other adversary is locked out, and vice versa. The one that we are going to talk about mostly here is cryptographic separation, where the entities can in fact access the physical media that's involved, but still, even though they can access the physical media, they are basically separated by the mathematics of cryptography. And then there is logical separation, which is something that we rely on a whole lot in our computer systems. And logical separation basically means that there is some kind of, you can think of it as some kind of logic or software or some kind of operating system that is putting a barrier between different entities and making sure that one entity cannot know anything about what's going on with the other entity, right? So in a sense, logical separation relies on the correct operation of some other entity that is observing the two adversarial the two adversaries. And so for instance, we have talked about reference monitors in the past, and logical separation often goes hand in hand with reference monitors. So we will talk about that later, but right now our goal is to talk about cryptographic separation. Okay, so cryptographic separation is in particular applied when you talk about communication security, right? So that's where it's most important. But of course, it could also be used within systems to protect highly sensitive data. Okay, so what is communication security? It basically addresses how you protect data when you transmit it from one location to another. Okay, whereas system security is looking at security at the endpoints. Okay, so when some data resides on your computer, it often is not protected based on cryptography, but it is protected on some kind of logical separation. For instance, the operating system is enforcing certain access control policies based on, say, file permissions, or your firewall is enforcing certain policies. So these are all provide some way to separate, but that's all dependent upon some software underneath that's working correctly to enforce these access control policies. In the case of communication security, you generally cannot assume that the channel on which you're transmitting is secure, and therefore you need to develop really powerful security primitives that can work correctly in spite of the fact that an adversary may be in control of the channel over which you are transmitting information. So when we think about security concerns in networks or during transmission, we can identify four types of issues, right? So the first picture at the top shows you what is normal information flow, and then the adversary can try to affect it in multiple ways. The very first and the simplest one is interrupting the flow. So you can cut the cable, for instance, and that affects the availability property of this particular communication. The other thing that the adversary could do is, instead of cutting the link, they may, snoop on the link and then try to siphon off information so they know what's being talked about, and that is an attack on confidentiality. Then the third one is a modification. So the adversary intercepts the message and modifies it and sends it over, and that is an attack on integrity and also authenticity, right? So again, these words have an English meaning, and that's the technical meaning is very consistent with the English meaning, and we'll come to the technical meaning later on. And then finally, non-repudiability, where the message may not even have been originally sent, but the adversary creates this message and sends it to the receiver, and the receiver might think that it is actually coming from someone else, right? So that's a fabricated message, and that relates to a property known as non-repudiability. Okay, so the idea of cryptography is to prevent all of these types of attacks, right? And the way it is done is you encode the data in such a way that these attacks become infeasible, okay? And a cryptographic algorithm is characterized by two factors, two things. One is the encryption algorithm, and the other is the encryption key, right? So in general, it's quite difficult to design good encryption algorithms. And so, what we teach everybody is never to try to design an encryption algorithm yourself, right? So sometimes it's tempting to think, okay, if I come up with a brand new encryption algorithm, then nobody will know what the algorithm is, and therefore they will not be able to figure out what's going on. But in reality, you really don't know enough to design an algorithm, and most algorithms you can design can be fairly easily broken. And so it's incredibly hard to design good encryption algorithms, so you should not even try to do that. And so this is, when people try to design an encryption algorithm on their own, they are kind of relying on this notion of security by obscurity. If only I know what the algorithm is, then nobody can figure out exactly what I'm transmitting. But again, experience has proven that this very rarely works in the case of cryptography, right? And so don't ever go for that. Instead, rely, your security must be underpinned by this secrecy of the encryption key rather than the encryption algorithm, right? Instead, what you need to do is you need to make sure that the encryption algorithm is publicized widely so that it can be studied by many experts, and any problems, potential problems, be found out and fixed rather than not being known to anybody. Okay, so in the context of cryptography, there are some terms that you should be familiar with. Plain text means it's before encryption, so unencrypted and plain text kind of mean the same thing. Ciphertext means encrypted, and then we have the notion of the notation for encryption, which here says EK of X, which basically says that you're doing the encryption operation with the key K, right? So the key appears as a subscript in this particular case, and then you have decryption, which is also using the similar notation, and what we'll talk next is about cryptanalysis, which means that the attacker or the adversary is trying to figure out whether the key or the message, right, the encrypted message, or both. Okay, so the adversary might carry out one of 5 types of attacks, and the differences here are based on the information that's available to the adversary, right? So ciphertext only means the adversary knows the encryption algorithm and the ciphertext, but they don't know the key or the corresponding plain text. Okay. Now, known plain text means that they know the encryption algorithm, they know the ciphertext. So in all these cases, of course, they're going to have the ciphertext because ciphertext is transmitted on the wire, and we assume that the attacker can siphon off anything from the wire. So, in the known plain text case, in addition to what you have in the ciphertext only case, the attacker also has one or more plain text ciphertext pairs. So they have some kind of a, you can think of it as some kind of a code book type of thing, that you have some examples based on which you can start analyzing what the key might be. Chosen plain text means in addition to maybe some known plain text, then the attacker may be able to actually choose which plain text and the corresponding ciphertext pairs they have access to. And this means that by choosing the plain text messages appropriately, that may make the key discovery problem somewhat easier, right? And then so on, okay? So there are, so I'm not going to go through the rest of the list here. So when we are talking about cryptography, it's necessary to sort of bring up this concept of steganography, which is kind of related, but really is a completely different thing, right? So the goal of cryptography is to protect information, but you aren't trying to, hide the fact that you have sensitive information to protect. Okay, so if you send encrypted data over a wire, an adversary can typically figure out that you are sending this encrypted data. So you aren't hiding the fact that the data is being sent. But there are situations where you want to hide the presence of the data itself, and that's where you use steganography. Okay, so think of a situation where, let's say, a convict or a mob boss in the prison is trying to send a secret message to his organization, right? So in that case, obviously, if they try to send a normal message, that wouldn't be permitted. So they need to somehow hide this in some way, and then they might use some kind of steganography. Okay, so steganography is useful if communication is monitored for suspicious content by someone, and if they see that suspicious content, they will simply not transmit it, right? So that's the idea, and if you want to get your message across in spite of this kind of surveillance and censorship, then you are going to make sure that you are going to that you might use steganography. Okay, and the concept of watermark is closely related, right? So watermark is an invisible data that's encoded in messages, and they'll be retained in copies, and is robust in the face of certain image transformation operations. So watermarks are often used in multimedia data, images, audio, things like that, in order to protect or at least trace when the data is copied. Okay, so let's stop here and